This is our 29th lesson on hermeneutics. We had trouble with the internet last week, so we're re-recording this class. And so hopefully we won't have that trouble again. I thought it was a microphone, but it wasn't. I checked everything, and the microphone was working just fine. And so it was internet. I had some other reasons to think it was internet as well. We're going to look at social customs and Bible interpretation. This is our first lesson on this. It's very important since there are several doctrines that will be developed from the principles used in this sermon, on this lesson. Social customs are of three types. Some customs are morally good, some customs are morally neutral, and some are morally evil. Well, if we look at these three categories, we would never want to do a morally evil social custom. So that's out of the picture. If it's morally good, we ought to be doing it. And the only time that we decide whether to do it or not is if it was morally neutral. So there are three categories. A lot of people incorrectly think there's only two categories of things, and the two categories would be good and evil. But some things are neutral. And so what we have here is some things are neither good nor evil. And so we have to look at from that standpoint. So that's what we're going to be looking at. We'll be looking at neutral customs, and they'll be violated. We are to violate a neutral custom if it would hinder the cause of Christ, if we follow that custom. And if it would help us in influencing people for good, then we ought to follow the custom. So this is our test of neutral customs. If it will help the cause of Christ, let's go ahead and follow it. If it hurts the cause of Christ, we don't do it. And if it's still neutral, we just can do it or not do it. It won't matter. Paul instructed the church and us thereby to follow some customs. And we look in 1 Corinthians 14:33b. The American Standard divides verse 33 into two parts, and King James has it continuing into 34 as one sentence. But I believe the American Standard has it correctly broken up. And I'll take the last half of verse 33. And is it merely a social custom only for the first century? That's a good question we want to answer. Let's look, if we might, and I have an extensive discussion of this in my Role of Women Combined Edition book. I devote a whole chapter to each of these passages, 1 to chapter 11, 1 Corinthians 1 to chapter 14. Jesus conducted himself contrary to social custom in order to advance the gospel. Now we'll look at verse John 4:27 first, and we'll come back to verse 9 later. But what we have here is, this is a Samaritan woman at the well, and Jesus has been talking with her, and upon this came his disciples, and they marveled that he was speaking with a woman. Well, why would they marvel? Well, because it was a custom that a rabbi wouldn't have anything to do with a woman. He wouldn't speak with a woman, which is a ridiculous custom, but that was their custom. And he said, no man said, what seekest thou, or why speakest thou with her? They didn't ask him, but they were amazed that it was happening. And particularly because she was a Samaritan as well. And so we have a problem. We have two problems here. She's a woman, and secondly, she's not of the Jewish race. She's a Samaritan, which appears, to the best we can tell, to be a cross between Jews and Gentiles intermarried with one another. So the Samaritans appear to be a mixed race of Jewish blood and Gentile blood. And Jesus conducted himself contrary to custom in order to advance the gospel in this passage. So we have a pattern for us as well. Let's back up to verse 9. Now the Samaritan woman therefore saith unto him, How is it thou, being a Jew, ask a drink of me, who am a Samaritan woman? Well, when we read verse 9, that first part of it, we don't know what she's talking about when she says this. But John, whenever he puts a parenthetical statement in here, he says, for Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. And so we now, as we read this, we know what the problem is. So she said, why do you ask to drink of me? Because I'm a Samaritan. And she knew the Jews wouldn't have anything to do with Samaritans. I have no dealings with them. But he was violating this custom. Now, this custom was not commanded by God for the Jews. The Jews were commanded not to engage in idolatry and partake of the wickedness of the nations round about them. But to have no dealings with them was not what was taught in the Old Testament scriptures. Now let's look at this, and we have what's called an enthymeme, an incomplete argument. We don't have the major premise. We do have the minor premise. Jesus is one who violated a neutral social custom when the custom hindered the advancement of the gospel. Now that's the true statement. The conclusion is Jesus is one who did good. Now we know this from 1 Peter 2:21-22. He did no sin, so everything he did was good. Now when we go back into our principles of logic, we can reconstruct that major premise. That's what we're going to do here, and with called an enthymeme. So the only major premise that would make this syllogism valid, that means properly constructed, is all those who violated a neutral social custom when the custom hindered the advancement of the gospel are those who did good. So that's our principle now. So we have now a principle that will tell us, a generic principle now, and we violate a neutral social custom when it hinders the advancement of the gospel. And that's one situation where we would violate the custom. Are there any questions? The major premise will be used in other arguments in the study. So we'll use that major premise now that we've developed here. And we go to Romans 3:8. We should never sin. So we put into three categories, the customs. Some are good, some are neutral, and some are evil or wicked. And so we'll never do one that's wicked. Romans 3:8, Paul says, and why not, as we are slanderously reported. Now, slander is a false accusation, and that's what the Greek word means. So someone has falsely charged us with saying or affirming that we say, they're claiming we say this, let us do evil that good may come. Then he says, whose condemnation is just, they're properly condemned because this is a slanderous statement. We don't say this, we don't teach this. We would never do evil that good would come. So if we find that the custom is evil, we should not ever follow it. Since we should never sin to bring about good, it is not a sin to violate neutral social customs when it would hinder the advancement of the gospel to observe the customs. So now then, we have a principle here. We're going to violate a custom. If it's neutral, we have to first determine it's neutral. We're going to violate that custom if it would hinder the cause of Christ to observe the custom. In this case, the custom was that the Jews had no dealings with Samaritans. And Jesus had dealings with her, and particularly with a woman. Two customs he violated. And so this woman was taught some aspect of the gospel here. I like to be a Pollyanna and think she may have obeyed the gospel in Acts 8. And we don't know that for sure, but I'm hoping she did. And just quite possible that she did there in Acts 8 when Philip took the gospel to the Samaritans. Right? Now, when we do this, it's therefore a good work to violate customs which hinder the cause of Christ. But they have to be neutral customs, so we can type in the word neutral right here, neutral customs, which hinder the cause of Christ. And so the custom has to be neutral for us to violate it. This only applies to neutral customs and evil social customs. We should never observe them under any condition. So we're looking really at neutral social customs. Now, the context of Acts 10, verses 15 through 16, is Acts 10, verses 1 through 11, 18. So this is the 10th chapter, the whole 10th chapter of Acts. The first 18 verses of chapter 11, this is the second recording of it. And in Acts 15, 6 through 11, we see a report of this by the Apostle Peter. He gave a report of this incident. So these are the passages that would give you the context of this. Peter violated Jewish social customs in order to bring the gospel to the Gentiles. So now then we have another principle. We should violate that custom if it hinders the gospel, the presentation of the gospel. In this case, it was hindering the presentation of the gospel. So we look into it, and in Acts 10:15, remember what happened? Peter was given a vision, and all these animals were on this great sheet that was lowered to him. He was hungry, and he was told to rise, kill, and eat, and that was repeated 3 times. Each time he said, "Not so, Lord, I've never eaten anything that's common or unclean." Now, what we learned here is Peter probably still thought some things were unclean, not necessarily in a sinful uncleanness, but uncleanness in the ceremonial sense. And I don't believe we can find any evidence that we ever have in the New Testament, that is, a ceremonial uncleanness. And so what we have here is Peter responds to this. And so a voice came unto him saying the second time, remember this is repeated 3 times, what God hath cleansed, make not thou common. And this was done thrice, 3 times, and straightway the vessel was received up into heaven. All manner of full-footed beasts and creeping things. Creeping things usually refers to animals that are like snakes and reptiles, which were unclean animals to a Jew. In Acts 11, verses 9 through 11, we have a second account of this event. We get more information in Acts 15, verses 7 through 11, which you need to put all 3 of these passages together to get the full picture of what's going on with Cornelius. This is a man named Cornelius. Peter was told in Acts 10:27 that other commandments overrode the commandment to follow customs. Now, what is going on here? Peter is given a vision regarding animals eating animals. And God says, these animals are no longer unclean. And Peter is supposed to draw some kind of a conclusion from this. And he does draw the right conclusion. The a fortiori principle is the animals which are inferior to man are cleansed, and men are cleansed. That's the lesson with the a fortiori principle that the Apostle Peter learned and stated. And as he talked with him, he went in, talked with Cornelius, and found as many come together and said unto them, speaking to all these people that are Gentiles, ye yourselves know how it is an unlawful thing for a man that is a Jew to join himself or come into one of another nation. And yet unto me hath God showed that I should call no man common or unclean. But the visions only dealt with animals. If we understand the a fortiori principle, we understand what his argument was. God told him the animals were clean. Peter rightfully was the reason that the people are no longer unclean. The animals are no longer unclean, and the people are no longer unclean. Any questions or comments? Again, he is expected to use the a fortiori principle here, which we've already developed in this series of lessons. And he does use it and uses it correctly. Now, let's go to Galatians chapter 2. We won't go any further in this passage in Acts 10, Acts 11, Acts 15. But when Cephas came to Antioch, now Cephas is another name for Peter. This is the Aramaic name for Peter. This is the Aramaic word for a stone. And he came to Antioch. I resisted him to the face because he stood condemned. So Paul rebuked Peter, and he did it to his face. He didn't do it behind his back. He stood up against him right here. And now in verse 12, he's going to explain what he did that caused him to be condemned. Before that certain came from James. Now, when you see the word certain, it's tes in Greek, and it usually refers to somebody prominent. We don't know who this person was, but this is, he ate with the Gentiles before that person came. Someone prominent came. But when they came, and so certain ones came, certain prominent people came from the church where James was, that would be Jerusalem. And they came, he drew back. Drew back from who? From the Gentiles, and separated himself from the Gentiles, fearing them that were of the circumcision. So now he was afraid of these people. Even an apostle can be pressured to do something wrong. And being an apostle didn't remove temptation from him. And so the rest of the Jews dissembled likewise with him. Now, right here, the word dissemble is the word that's translated played the hypocrite. It's the verb form of the word played the hypocrite. Hypocrites is the noun form of it. So this is the verb form of it. So they played the hypocrite. So the rest of the Jews dissembled likewise with him. So Paul is saying here, when he writes this, that not only did Peter play the hypocrite and do this, but he pulled the rest of these people with him. And so they dissembled likewise with him, the rest of the Jews. And even Barnabas was carried away with this dissimulation, with this hypocrisy. And so Barnabas should have known better, because Barnabas had gone out in the first missionary journey with Paul. But he got carried away with it too. It is possible, and we need to be aware of it, that any time we can be pressured and not think clearly and then do something we shouldn't do. There's one way to fix it. Repent, confess it, go back and do what's right. That's pretty simple. God allows us to do that. Of course, he doesn't want us to sin. But he has a way to forgive us when we do sin. And I believe God is wonderful in doing this, being patient with me when I'm not everything I should be. But he pulled these with him. He pulled the rest of the Jews along with him. Even Barnabas was pulled into this. And if you read carefully, he was rebuked by Paul. And now then, what do we say? Did Paul rebuke the rest of the Jews? Not directly. We don't have a word evidence that he did directly. He might have, but he didn't have to. A fortiori principle says what is true of the lesser is true of the greater, and we can use transposition or contraposition. We can use that logical process and reverse the antecedent and consequent, negate both of them. That's all you got to do. And so when we see here, that would still be true. So if what's true of the lesser is true of the greater, what's not true of the greater is not true of the lesser. So we reverse it. So if the apostle Peter, the greater of those, an apostle of the church, was not to play the hypocrite, then those that have been led by him, including Barnabas, who were lesser than him in office and status, were not to do it either. So he didn't have to rebuke all of them if he rebuked the leader. That's all that had to be done. So if there's a problem in the church and there's one person leading, and that you can get that person to repent, probably those that are following him will follow along and repent as well. But you just have to publicly rebuke that one that had been taking the lead, in this case, Peter. So the a fortiori principle, once he's told he can't do that, the lesser people are told they can't do it either. Now, any questions? right? This was in order not to become stumbling blocks, okay? We're commanded to conform to neutral customs. We don't want to be a stumbling block to anybody. And either the weak members of the Lord's church, it'll be a stumbling block to weak members of the church, and we won't be a stumbling block to those in the world. So those are two people that we could be a stumbling block to. In this case here, Peter was a stumbling block to one who would be thought to be strong, and that would be Barnabas. But even Barnabas was carried away with it. That's why he said it, even Barnabas. And it's almost like he's amazed to say it when he says right here, even Barnabas. So we see we can lead a strong person even into error. Now then, the question of eating meats that have been sacrificed to idols is discussed in 1 Corinthians 8, 1 through 13. I've had a little problem here. I'll be coughing a little bit. I'm sorry. It's not inherently wrong to eat meat sacrificed to idols. We see this from 1 Corinthians 8, 4 through 8. Now, the meat is just meat. And so if you go and buy some meat at a meat market and someone who's evil grew that meat and sold it, you're not responsible if you paid a fair price for the meat and it's just meat. And you're not sinning to eat that meat if some wicked person actually grew the beef and meat and the pork, whatever it might be, chickens or whatever, and they grew that animal and even they butchered it. But so the Jews, however, were told not to eat this meat under the law of Moses, probably because they weren't mature enough to separate out the fact that it was just meat. And so they probably were thinking they were worshiping that idol whenever they ate that meat that had been sacrificed to idols. That's most likely what the problem was. But anyhow, he does tell us in 1 Corinthians 8, 4 through 8, that it's not sinful or wrong to eat that meat. We should not become a stumbling block to the weak, so what should we do? Well, if we have weak brethren that think we're sinning when we eat that meat, which we know is okay to eat, then the best thing to do, because we want their soul to be saved, because love is an overriding motive here. With our love for them, we want them to be saved. And maybe they're weak right now, but we're going to get them into a saved condition and hopefully teach them so that they'll distinguish between this. But in the meantime, we're not going to eat that meat. We shouldn't eat it because it could be a stumbling block to them and cause them to stumble. Any questions? Other matters, such as eating any kind of meats, observing special days, etc., are discussed in Romans 14, 1 through 23. Now, that class is recorded on the internet. And in addition, we're teaching a class right now on 1 Corinthians. We've covered chapter 8, and it's also on YouTube on the internet. So you can access our discussion of those verses. In this passage, Romans 14, the strong are admonished to bear with the weaker brethren. So what we do is we don't run roughshod over them. We try to make sure we don't drive them away from the Lord, their salvation. That's important. 1 Corinthians 9, Paul says we become all things in order to save men. Let's look at this verse. For though I am free from all men, I brought myself under bondage to all that I might gain the more. So I brought myself under bondage. I yielded to the thoughts of these people as long as it was in a neutral area. In other words, he wasn't going to do anything that was sinful, and he wasn't going to abstain from any custom that was good. So he says here, to elaborate on this, and to the Jews, I became as a Jew. Now, I don't know, he doesn't tell us exactly what he did here, but I would assume that he observed the Sabbath day when he was around Jews. There will be nothing wrong with a Christian taking Saturday, the seventh day of the week, off and not working. There's nothing wrong with that. And that is certainly not sinful to do it. That's a neutral custom. Under the law of Moses, it was required. So we're trying to get these people who think they're still under the law of Moses, we're trying to get them to listen to us. And Paul was a Jew, and so if he had just violated the Sabbath in the eyes of these people, he wouldn't be in the eyes of God. But if he had violated it in their eyes, they wouldn't listen to him and might not be receptive to the gospel. So again, he gives up his liberty so that he might save souls. And that's the point he's making. And it might be that we're talking about kosher food. And so there's nothing wrong with eating that kind of food. It's perfectly all right. And so when he was around the Jews, he probably ate kosher food. He probably observed the Sabbath. He might have observed some of the other things that they did, but I can see those two things for sure. Right? And to the Jews, I became as the Jews, that I might gain the Jews, to them that are under the law, as under the law. So those that are under the law, that consider themselves to be under the law of Moses, I conducted myself as one under the law. I think he's saying that I observed the Sabbath. Nothing wrong with it. He had Timothy circumcised, and he had probably ate kosher food for sure, those things, and some other things that might, that would be normal, would be all right to do. Right? But he says, as to them that are under the law, as under the law, not being myself under the law. I wasn't under the law. I knew I wasn't obligated to do this, but I did it so that I might gain them that are under the law. It had a purpose. Now, I see three things that he did, and probably other things, but certainly probably observing the Sabbath, which would not be wrong, and eating kosher food, which would not be wrong. And third was in circumcising Timothy, which would not be wrong. However, if you tried to bind it upon other people, it would be wrong. If you tried to bind the Sabbath keeping and the kosher food on other people, it would be wrong. And so this is one of these neutral areas, and it was not wrong to eat what the Gentiles ate. Peter was doing it. Then he got all upset, got scared, and withdrew himself from back in Galatians 2. All right. 1 Corinthians 9:21, to them that are without law, that is, those that are not under the law of Moses, as without law, not being without law to God, but under the law to Christ, that might gain that are without law. So those that are without the law of Moses, they don't have the law of Moses, but I lived in such a way as not to drive them away from obeying the gospel. Again, our principle is this: if they had an evil social custom, Paul would observe it. If it was a good social custom, he would do it automatically. And if it's neutral, he'd look at it and see if it's going to help the cause of Christ if he observes it. And that'll determine whether he observes it or not. So let's look at this. To them that are without law, as without law, not being without law to God, but under law to Christ, that I might gain them that are without law. To the weak, I became weak. That I might gain the weak, I become all things to all men, that I may by all means save some. Now, here's the problem in hermeneutics in interpreting the scripture. The word all is always limited by the context. And what we see here, Paul doesn't say that I would kill people in order to cause people to be saved. He doesn't say I'd lie to people in order to cause them to be saved, or any other thing. He is saying, I will do what's lawful. I will do what's not sinful. So any of these customs, I'm going to observe them as long as they don't cause me to sin. It won't be an evil custom. And I do all things for the gospel's sake, all things, but in this context, all things that are lawful for the gospel's sake, that I may be a joint partaker. This again is in this realm of the neutral customs, He's going to look at them, see if they're going to advance the cause of Christ. If they do, he's going to do them. If it would hinder the cause of Christ, he won't do them. Any questions or comments? We should follow customs which are either good or neutral. And again, all things should be classified into three categories. And there's not two categories, good and evil. There's good customs, there's evil customs, and then there's neutral customs. Three categories, and some things are neutral. All right. Now, whether a person observes the Sabbath or not is neutral. Now, once I try to make a neutral custom binding on other people, I've gone too far. And so that's important that we understand that. We should always follow customs that are good. Now, I've been told this from several sources. The custom of people in Mexico, when they care for their parents, is the oldest child, I think probably the oldest son, but I'm not sure about that, would take the parents into his home and take care of them when they got old. And the whole community would highly respect them for it. They were looked upon in great favor for taking care of mom and daddy. And so it was a thing to do. It's the thing to do in their society. But this is a good custom. You can't find anything wrong with that custom. It's a good custom. And so I believe that's one good custom. So that's a custom. If we have that custom among our Mexican neighbors, our Mexican friends from Mexico, I believe this is a wonderful custom. And it's wonderful that they do this. It is good. Nothing wrong with it whatsoever. Right? Now, let me point out here, suppose the oldest child was not very wealthy and they had another child, younger, that was wealthy. I would think that the younger one should aid the older one financially and to help them out in this regard, to give them help. And I believe this would be, I believe God would bless them for doing it, for doing that. And so this is a good thing. However, I was told, I got this from several sources, that an older custom of the Inuits, or Eskimos, we call them Eskimos, was that they abandoned their parents when they got to where they couldn't get around very much. They just put them out on the ice and let the polar bears eat them. Now, I was told that was true. If that's a custom, that is an evil custom, and no way in the world we could do that and follow that custom. So what we do, let's follow the Mexican people's custom and help them out. And again, I would say the younger child who maybe has wealth, he can help out the older one and give them some aid to care for mom and daddy. Under the law of Moses, the oldest son got a double portion of inheritance, and it was his job to take care of mom and daddy. I think, and I don't have explicit information to prove it, but I'm convinced in my mind that God set it up that way because that oldest child is going to get a double inheritance so he can take care of mom and daddy when they get old. He'll have that extra money to be able to take care of the extra property. And I believe that's a good custom. It's in the Old Testament, of course. And so the Mexican people are probably following Old Testament scriptures, and that's a good custom. Nothing wrong with it whatsoever. But the Eskimos, they had it all wrong, if what I've been told is right. We should examine the effects of a custom that is neutral, but abandoning the parents on the ice to let the polar bears eat them is not a good custom. It's evil. It's certainly nothing good about that whatsoever. It's not neutral, so we don't have that option. We can care for them, let the oldest child care for them. We can let the younger child care for them, one that was maybe had more wealth. And so it wouldn't have to be the oldest child, but that's a good custom. And the Mexican people following it is very commendable. It certainly ought to be followed, if at all possible. It's certainly not wrong to follow that custom. Now, this would apply to such custom as women wearing a veil. And I have a whole chapter devoted to this in my Role of Women book, combined edition. It has not been printed, but it's in electronic format. And I developed this in some great detail with a lot of information that we lay out. But he says, but every woman praying or prophesying with her head unveiled, dishonors her head, for it is one and the same as she were shaven. For if a woman is not veiled, let her also be shorn. But if it's a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be veiled. So if she's not to be veiled, then it's not a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven. So in a situation when we take this last statement, and I'll move my mouse over it right here, from it is a shame to a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be veiled, then let her be veiled. And we can reverse it with transposition or contraposition and say, if she is not to be veiled, then it's not a shame for her to be shorn or shaven. So if it's not a shame for her to be shorn or shaven, then you don't have to have her veiled. So that's what he's saying. And when we put this in here and look at it, I believe there's evidence from information that we have that a woman that was shaven, we have some information that there were about 1,000 priestesses of Temple Aphrodite Pandemos who were prostitutes, and they would sell their bodies for money to support the temple. And so there were slave girls that did this. Now, how in the streets are you going to distinguish between a woman who's a free woman and not one of these prostitutes and one who is a prostitute? Well, the prostitutes had to have their head shaven. And so they would shave their head, and then it grows back a little bit, and then on a monthly or two, or every 2 or 3 months, they're going to shave it again. So that's going to be the mark of the prostitute. But we also see that there's evidence that a woman who committed adultery, her husband would shave her head, send her out. And so she's no different than the prostitute because she committed adultery. And so she shaved her head. We have information, and I document all this in my book. Now, I'm convinced that there's also evidence that the slave girls had their heads shaven. And so, but how are you going to distinguish a slave girl from a prostitute if they have their head shaven? Well, the slave girl will wear a veil over her head, and that will distinguish her from the prostitute. And a free woman, she'd have a full head of hair. Now, I believe that's what we find here. And if we put this last one and reverse it, if she is not to be veiled, then it's not a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven. Now, if we go back to the Old Testament, this was a principle in the 11th chapter of 1 Corinthians that started in Eden. And he lays it out, starting back in Eden. This is the principle. Now, when we ask ourselves this, if this is a timeless principle with regard to the women, are women always, was it a shameful thing for them to shave their heads? And the answer is no. Because a captive woman who was going to be married to a man would have her head shaven. And they would shave her head. Now, this is in the Old Testament. God commanded it. So if this woman is a shame for her to have her head shaven in the Old Testament times, then God wouldn't have had her to shave her head when she's going to marry a Jewish man, a captive woman. And so I document this also. Now, any comments or questions? So I'm convinced that right here, that what we have is we have a free woman had a full head of hair, and a slave girl had her head shaven to distinguish her from the free woman, but she would wear a veil so the people wouldn't think she's a prostitute. And then the prostitute would have her head shaven, and she had to keep it shaven, couldn't cover it, because that was the mark to the men that she was available for sexual relations by paying her as a prostitute. And of course, a woman who committed adultery, she was treated like a prostitute by having her head shaven. I've documented that in among the Germans and it appears among the Romans as well. Any questions? Women in Corinth were to wear a veil, a head covering, because it was a symbol of subjection in the Roman Jewish societies as well. So this became an external symbol of it. And so they had to wear this head covering. It's a symbol of subjection as well. Now, prostitutes and slave women if a prostitute had obeyed the gospel while her hair was short, she'd have to wear a veil when she came to worship. She'd wear a veil. If she left that prostitution, it'd be someone had to buy her out of it. She's a slave. It would be a hard thing. But it's an awful thing to women to be forced into that. I'm not dealing with what happened to them. There's evidence from Roman statues of women wearing a head covering, but not a veil on the face that covered the face. So let's look at some of these. We have this as a relief carving, which is basically, we have it carved out of the stone and we don't see the back side of it, just the front side. That's called a relief carving. These are three different women. Notice the veils that they have over their heads. And they don't cover their faces. They have their head covered. And here and here and here. Right? Another one, and her arms are broken off. And so she has a veil over her as well. This woman does. Here's another woman that has a veil. And now, it's possible the presence of a veil was the mark of a harlot, but I don't think so. Genesis 38 might have been the mark of a harlot in Genesis 38, but I don't think it was in First Corinthians in Corinth. So customs changed. Here's a woman named Tamar. The levirate marriage. Her first husband was wicked. God killed him. Second husband, he was wicked too. He didn't do what God told him to do. He spilled his seed and God killed him. And Judah got to thinking there was something wrong with Tamar because he'd lost two sons to her. It wasn't her that was the problem. It was these men, his sons. So Judah promised that Tamar could have the younger son, who was just a boy at this time, and she would have children by him. Well, she finds out that the boy's grown up and Judah hadn't kept his word. And so what she did, she put off from her the garments of her widowhood. So apparently there was some kind of clothing that widows wore. I remember in older times in the United States, a widow woman would wear black and covered herself with her veil and wrapped herself and sat in the gate of Enaim, which is, by the way, to Timnah. Of course, she saw that Shelah, and that's Judah's son, his third son, was grown up, and she was not given unto him to wife. So he was supposed to take her as his wife and have a child by her. And of course, that was according to the patriarchal law. And it also was under the law of Moses called the levirate marriage. When Judah saw her, because she had a veil on, in this case, her face was covered, he thought her to be a harlot, for she had covered her face. Now, this word for here might be that harlots covered their faces. It's possible. It might be that he thought she was a harlot for where she was sitting, and he couldn't see her face and didn't know who she was. So there's two possibilities with this word for, and I don't know which one is correct. I'm not going to be dogmatic about that. It might be that harlots wore a veil so that you wouldn't know who they were. So a married woman could sell herself and get money and hide her identity from men, okay, if she put a veil on. That's a possibility, and it's possible that she had this veil on so he wouldn't know her. And whatever the case, she'd covered her face. Probably he just didn't recognize her, okay? But he thought she was a harlot. Since moral principles are timeless, unchanging, and the significance of wearing of a veil changed with time, It's not a moral principle, but a matter of social custom. We see that Sarah didn't wear a veil because they knew she was pretty, knew she was beautiful. Same thing with Rachel, and the same thing with Rebecca. And we see this. We see this as well. And when Hannah was praying, Eli could see her face, so she wasn't wearing a veil over her face in that sense. Okay, you know that to be the case. So it's not a moral principle, but a matter of social custom. It has to be. If this is a timeless principle, it has to be a custom. Social customs are three types. They're either morally good, morally neutral, or morally evil in nature. All right. Neutral customs are to be violated if they hinder the cause of Christ and followed if they help the cause of Christ. We are instructed to follow some customs and always follow good customs. And always follow customs that are morally good. Never follow customs that are morally evil. If we go back to the people from Mexico, that's a good custom that the oldest child takes care of mom and daddy. It's probably the oldest son. I'm not sure about that. But whatever the case, that oldest child that's taking care of them, that is a good custom. And there's no way in the world the church ought to go and try to change that custom. And however, a Christian that's younger, the younger Mexican, had Mexican parents, and he's much more wealthy than his older sibling that's taking care of mom and daddy, I think God would bless him if he helped out his sibling to care for mom and daddy. God would bless him. I believe he would. So we should examine the effects of a custom that's neutral. This may entail giving up some of our liberties. We may give up liberty. And there's nothing wrong with giving up my liberty. The Lord gave up his liberty to come to the earth and to save me. I can give up these little things and to try to save other people. Why can't I follow his lead? I believe we should. Any questions? Okay.